This show was previously broadcast live on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com.
Welcome to Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we are looking at the culture of consciousness, the intersection of technology, mind, and the future. One of the interesting things about our moment right now is our increasing sense of the power of the collective, of masses of individuals who are brought together in a shared, productive, creative activity that really produces whole new realms of experience, of thought, of objects of knowledge, of new kinds of creativity and new kinds of labor. And we know this mostly through the Internet, because the Internet is able to link together huge numbers of individuals in a distributed way and to feed back their work and their creativity and their thoughts and ideas to each other through the incredible powers of machine intelligence, if you will, that huge worlds emerge. You know, when you think about the explosion of social networking sites or Twitter, you get the sense of the ways that masses of individuals can be drawn together into this new kind of collective space. Just to take Twitter, for example, you have, you know, people following hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, this sort of stream of little bits coming from all of these different people and weaving together this kind of tapestry that itself becomes increasingly responsive to the world at large, such that people who are in those networks often find out about events happening in other sides of the world much more quickly than traditional news media. There becomes a sort of responsiveness and an elasticity and something that's happening with the group, almost a kind of group mind that is emerging. Another example is like the SETI at Home project, where people just turned over their computers to these massively parallel computational processes that were searching for signs of intelligent life in the cosmos, so that suddenly you use this great network of technology in order to intensify the power of the collective and create new kinds of networks. But our guest today, Margaret and Wertheim, has had another experience of a kind of collective process emerging from a project that she had did with science, with technology, but also manifesting in a very different realm than the bodiless space of the Internet. But we'll get to her project in a little bit. I'm curious, we're going to bring on our co-host, Maja Daou, Expanding Minds esoteric librarian. I'm curious, do you think there's some kind of, what's your closest experience of a group mind happening?
Ooh, closest experience of a group mind.
Yeah.
I would have to say it was in high school when I was on the high school debate team. And that probably sounds pretty dorky, but we would all be together researching the same topic in libraries into like the wee hours of the night. Even when we would hang out like at parties sometimes, we would all be researching and reading books like Noam Chomsky, and we'd all be reading the same books and talking about the same thing. We'd be hanging out with each other like every day and traveling, so we'd be like on a tour bus. So it was almost kind of like we were a rock band a little bit, but we were all talking to each other, and it became literally like we would kind of have strange telepathic experiences, and we'd say like similar things in debate rounds. And so for me, it was my group mind experience was really through this very dorky high school debate land that it happened, but it was very intense and very much like everyone in the group experienced it, you know.
Yeah, and it's funny, we can think about it in terms of consciousness, but you can also just think about it in terms of people contributing to a single collective process or work.
Yeah.
Think about the AIDS quilt, from a while back, where you have individuals creating little bits that then go into weaving together this mass work of art, of commentary, of people coming together. And there's ways that those kinds of processes seem a little bit closer. It's like there's something we're discovering about the way that groups of people can come together and make new forms of value. But
yeah.
I'd like
what about
to bring
you,
up,
Erik? I know right now you're doing a production show on Burning Man. Are you seeing any of that in your production?
That's actually funny, because I've mostly been a writer and a speaker and a journalist and author, professor sometimes, and so I'm mostly working pretty solitary ways and being involved in this theatrical production. It's amazing to see how all of these disparate groups with their own kinds of issues and agenda, the musicians, the sound guys, the light guys, the front of house, all this stuff, and because it's a very organic process, we're not slick professionals. We're kind of all doing this and meeting each other for the first time. There are some very noticeable stages where things start to click together, and you start to get a sense of the whole entity learning how to integrate itself and act more efficiently and more productively. And it's not anything that any one individual is doing. It just sort of happens, and you can really sense the shift that happens as these collectives begin to kind of find themselves and go through certain phase states almost to new stages of integration.
Right.
But I want to bring on our guest, Margaret Wertheim. I've had the good fortune of knowing Margaret for many years. She spent a lot of her time as a science writer, and we'll talk about some of her really excellent books probably later in the show. But a few years ago, she started to do, almost on a whim, if I think, a very interesting project that has since metastasized into an amazing global phenomena. So, Margaret, thanks so much for being on Expanding Mind.
Lovely to be with you, Erik.
Very good. Well, since I haven't really said very much about your Crochet Reef project, so and I'm sure you've given the spiel many times now, but I would just love it if you could talk a little bit about what the project is and how it came to be.
Well, it's interesting that you raised, Erik, the issue. You talked about the AIDS quilt earlier, and many people have made the comment that our project is like the AIDS quilt of global warming. And the reason for that is that what the project is when I say we, it's my twin sister, and Christine and I set out 4 years ago to crochet a coral reef. And the project was inspired by a number of things, but one was the fact that actual living reefs all over the world are dying out. And we grew up in the state of Queensland, Australia, which is where the Great Barrier Reef is, so we're extremely aware that the crisis of the Barrier Reef was getting worse. And around the time we started the project, scientists were beginning to understand that the real devastation of reefs was not through pollutants, but actually through global warming. So the real decline of reefs over the past decade or two is a direct indication that global warming is real. It's not in the future. It's here on Earth, and it's really beginning to devastate ecologies now. And so we thought we could crochet a coral reef to bring some attention to the plight of the world's reefs. And we always imagined it would be a community project. We invited others around the world to join us in this project. Now you ask, why on earth would people be crocheting a coral reef? It's water, wool, they don't really come together naturally. But the reason that we are crocheting coral reef is because actually there is no better medium in the world to make a coral reef in than crochet. And that's because the very beautiful, immediately recognizable, distinctive crenellated forms that many reef organisms have are embodiments of a kind of geometry called hyperbolic geometry that is actually widely instantiated in nature, particularly in the marine realm, for very good biological reasons. And it turns out that the only way mathematicians have of modeling hyperbolic geometry is with crochet. And that was a discovery made by a mathematician at Cornell in 1997.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it sort of blows my mind that, I knew that mathematicians have been looking at hyperbolic space since the late 19th century, that I was like, why? When all this, you made this point in your fabulous TED Talk online that they had all of this material sort of in their face. You know, they're eating lettuce. They're looking at sea slugs occasionally, and yet it's right in their face, but they don't even make the connection. It's amazing that it was so late that people made that discovery.
Yes, mathematicians became aware of hyperbolic geometry at the beginning in the very early 19th century, and this was actually after several hundred years of trying to prove literally that anything like this was impossible. And it came out of their proofs, trying to prove that it was impossible, that they finally realized, well, actually, hyperbolic space is, mathematically speaking, a logical necessity. And so it was a mathematical discovery, purely mathematical discovery initially. And let me just explain for your audience the very simpleness of what this discovery it is. Hyperbolic geometry is the third kind of geometry of two dimensions, and your audience all know about the other two, which is Euclidean or plane geometry, and spherical geometry, which is the geometry of the surface of the Earth. So mathematicians had studied spherical and plane geometry for thousands of years, but it turned out that there is this other option called hyperbolic geometry, and the way that you can understand it, which is a beautiful thing actually, is that plane geometry represents a space with zero curvature. Spherical geometry represents a space with positive curvature, and hyperbolic geometry is a space with negative curvature. So in a very real way, hyperbolic geometry is the geometric equivalent of the negative numbers. And so just as it was a big revolution for mathematicians in the 16th and 17th centuries to discover negative numbers, so it was a big revolution for them to discover negatively curved space. And for a long time, it was just thought that this was a mathematical, a quirk of mathematics. But it does immediately raise the question, and some very perceptive people in the early 19th century did understand this, is this form instantiated in nature? Now, mathematicians of the 19th century never even considered looking at the lettuce on their plates or corals in the sea. Where they actually thought that negative space might be instantiated was in the architecture of the universe. And it in fact remains an open question now. Is the universe on a large scale positive, negative, or zero curvature? Most of the evidence suggests that it's zero curvature, that we live in a flat space on the biggest possible scale. But what was astounding is that, in fact, these negatively curved spaces are actually embodied literally on the lettuce leaves in our place. Every time you see those sort of frilly forms, there it is. It's a version of negatively curved space. And most beautifully in the crenellated forms of sea creatures, particularly coral reef organisms. Now, why couldn't mathematicians see that, as you asked, Erik? That actually raised very deep questions about the philosophy of mathematics and what mathematicians thought mathematics was and what they thought it could do and what they thought it couldn't do. And over the past 100 years, there has been, as it were, a revolution in mathematics, literally a mind-expanding revolution of what mathematicians understand mathematics to be.
Well, and that, to me, Margaret, kind of relates to a lot of the amazing work that you guys do at the Institute for Figuring, which is crossover. I mean, it's like these mathematicians, a lot of them separate mathematics from so many other things in the world, and it becomes this specialized field. And like we were talking about earlier with artistic endeavors that make collectives and share information, it's almost like they didn't see it in front of their face because they were creating a separation. But when you are actually making art and doing things, then you start to see, like, oh, well, I can see this mathematics and biology happening in front of me together, like united in a force through the unified projects that you guys do at your place. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about, while you were doing the project, if you guys made headway with understanding of that type of geometry, if you guys had mathematicians involved in it at all.
Well, in doing our project, our Crochet Coral Reef project, which, as Erik was suggesting before, there are now thousands and thousands of people all over the world doing this with us, from Cape Town to Sydney to New York to London. It's literally become a sort of unintended global worldwide movement. And one of the beautiful things about it is that when we do the workshops to teach people the techniques of crochet hyperbolics, we Chrissy or I always give a talk about the mathematics and the history of the mathematics and the history of Dr. Taimina's discovery that you could crochet this form. And what is extraordinary is that, these audiences are, regular people. They're not university academics. They're regular people. And by the end of it, they really are understanding very sophisticated things about the geometry of hyperbolic space, and they can ask very sophisticated questions, and they can make very sophisticated observations of their own. And by making these forms, actually doing the crochet, what you are doing is literally, I believe, it can be considered as a form of experimental mathematics. You're actually exploring these forms, these geometric structures, by making them, rather than standing at a blackboard or reading a textbook and imbibing the information through purely symbolic means. You are learning about it through plastic processes of material play. And it is Chrissy and my contention, and this is what we do with the Institute of Figuring primarily, is we believe that a whole lot of kinds of knowledge that is usually taught through purely symbolic abstract means at universities, things like mathematics, logic, physics, these things can also be, as it were, these forms of knowledge can be transmitted through plastic material processes. Now, are the people who learn through these processes going to be able to sit down and pass a university exam? No, they're not. But they do really learn a powerful amount of knowledge and receive a powerful insight into the structures. And so I really do think that there is a sense in which this is a revolutionary form of teaching.
It is, and I want to, why aren't hyperbolic and topology mathematicians participating in this project? Why aren't they crocheting too?
Well, I should say Dr. Taimina, who is the mathematician who discovered hyperbolic crochet, she's an adjunct at Cornell. She has been, we've done lectures with her, and she's the one who taught us the techniques, and we learned about the whole thing from her, and then we've expanded it into this. She was just doing the purely mathematical forms, the absolutely mathematically pure ones, and what we've done with the coral reef is to develop the techniques to take them away from the absolute purity of the mathematics, and it's sort of become an evolutionary process, which I can talk about in a bit if you like. But why haven't other mathematicians been involved? There's a very interesting and I think rather unfortunate thing that happens is that, like most academics, mathematicians are bound by, very arduous academic processes. They have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. They have to get tenure. They have to be seen to be doing all the right things to keep the respect of their peers, which usually means operating in the academic, highly symbolic world. So, like most academics, they don't have the time or the encouragement, and they're not even remotely prompted by their institutions to do any form of public outreach. Their job as academics, and what gets you respect and kudos and tenure and pay rises in the academic world, as you know, is you publish original research at the most academic level in peer-reviewed journals that are read by 300 people. And
so you guys don't have any male mathematicians trying to get involved in your project at all?
We've had almost no men at all try to be involved. We've always held that this project was open to absolutely everybody, but 99.99% of the people who've been involved are women. We've had a couple of men, but literally it's a couple. But no, I mean, the mathematicians, they know about this, and they think it's sweet and cute, but, they've got to publish, they've got to get on with their original research and publish in the journals, and really they're in no different position than any other academic. I mean, if you're a history professor or a professor of cultural studies, you're not. I mean, try reading most academic cultural studies journals. They're incomprehensible. Right.
Well, one of the things that I think is also great about taking the math out to folks is not just in a sort of a way of creating public outreach for science. There's a lot of public outreach for science now, and a lot of it is done by scientists with very specific political goals and agendas that don't necessarily actually have to do specifically with the public's understanding of science, so much as a way to sort of use public ideas about science to fight certain political battles and get institutional things done, et cetera, et cetera. What I really love about this project is that it not only, teaches, gives people new knowledge about a certain kind of geometry, but there's something very specific and marvelous and, frankly, somewhat spiritual about the connection between mathematics and nature and physical reality. And by giving people a hands-on way to explore and appreciate how a fairly abstract idea in mathematics, something that's more trippy and sort of symbolic and transcendent, it doesn't seem to have to do with our natural three-dimensional Euclidean world, nonetheless is actually part of nature. It really produces a real change, I think, in people's sense of the depth of what they do. I mean, I can only imagine that when you're crocheting one of these forms, even though the actual activity you're doing is not so different than any, a more conventional placemat or something that you might crochet, that the fact that you're incarnating these very interesting kind of mathematical situation is a real entry into some of the deeper mysteries about the relationship of number to reality. And I think that's part of what makes this particular expression of a kind of popular science practical crossover have a little extra flavor to it, as well as the sort of the pathos of the coral reef, this strange, it's like this strange sort of, it's almost it's a poem almost in terms of how as the reefs themselves are dying, you have thousands and tens of thousands of people who are sort of reproducing this artistic manifestation of a kind of organic, collective, almost natural process itself that mimics, and yet in this sort of, kind of sad way, because the reefs themselves are in such terrible shape. So it's really a remarkable project.
Well, thank you, Erik. The other thing that, I'll just make one comment, and then I want to come back to your idea about mathematics and mysticism, which is actually an issue that's very close to my heart. But on the way that the reef mimics natural processes, one of the other things that's really beautiful about this project is that not only is the individual person making the forms, mimicking what happens in nature, literally the growing of a coral structure in the water, but the whole project, the totality, is really a parallel to how living reefs replicate themselves. So the way that reefs spawn, or the way that new reefs come into being, is that corals do a thing called spawning, and it happens in the fall, and it's timed to both the cycles of the sun and the moon, and on a very particular night, always under the full moon, a whole vast area of reef will send out the spawn into the water. It's like a sort of version of underwater pollinating. Imagine a vast field of flowers all sending out their pollens, and the corals do this, and then the spores go off and they settle elsewhere, and new little reefs begin to grow. And that's really what's happened with our project. It's from the seeds of Chrissy and my living room, spores went out, and they're now going and settling all over the world. And new reefs are coming into being, and then they send out spores, and other reefs come into being. And so it has been this beautiful global collective process that in its collectivity actually mimics the way that real reefs reproduce. There's also another lovely collective version outcome of this, and that is that we all started from the very simple, mathematically pure forms that Dr. Taimina first crocheted in 1997, and that was an absolutely pure mathematical one. And there's a very strict, there's a very strict algorithm that underlies that. And basically what we've been doing with the reef is saying, let's deviate from the pure mathematical code that produces a mathematically perfect hyperbolic form. Because after all, nature never feels obliged to stick to a mathematically pure thing, just as there are lots of things in nature that are almost spherical but nothing that's a pure sphere. So too there are lots of things in nature that are almost hyperbolic but not pure. And it's when you introduce the imperfections from the mathematical purity that the forms immediately become to look organic, because that is what nature does. And so the process of the reef, both for Chrissy and I and for all of our contributors who get really into it, is you start exploring the variations of the code and what kind of, when you slightly alter the code, what sort of morphological shifts do you get. So just as life on Earth is underlined by a DNA code, and complexification and varying of that DNA code over 4 billion years has resulted in, the whole panoply of life on Earth that we have today. So we started from the simple set. There's a code underlying, as it were, the crochet tree of life. And just as real life started with very simple seeds and then complexified, so too the Crochet Reef project has been a process of people gradually varying the code, complexifying it, and making ever more complex structures. So
I want to ask you a question about this,
just
because I, for example, know absolutely nothing about crochet, and I'm really curious to sort of hammer down the connection between the idea of the algorithm, which is such an important part when we think about, computer processes and mathematical processes alike, the connection between algorithms and knitting or weaving or crocheting, and it seems like that's a really important link to make.
Yes, it is. I mean, an algorithm is basically a set of procedures. Do this, then do that, then do this, and then do that. I mean, another word for it, which is very similar in meaning, is a recipe. Put this together in this way. And computer code, computer programs are algorithms. And knitting patterns and crochet patterns are also algorithms. A knitting pattern is literally, as you're going along, it says knit 1, purl 1, knit 3, loop over, chain over, knit 4, 2. Basically, a knitting pattern or a crochet pattern is exactly like a piece of computer code. It's a symbolic representation of a set of actions. Do this, now do this specifically, now do that. If you ask, well, what is an alternative? There is an alternative, and it's a very critical one for mathematics. And the other possibility you can have of a way of describing something is not an algorithm, which is actually a description of a making process, but a formula, an equation, which is not really a description of making. It's a description of something that just is. It is divorced from time. And this is one of the reasons, this is a really critical distinction in mathematics, because you asked earlier, why couldn't mathematicians see these structures in the world around them? It relates to this question, the difference between what can be described through algorithms and what can be described through equations. And your audience is very familiar with a big revolution that happened in mathematics when mathematicians really came to understand what could be done with algorithms rather than equations. And that was the revolution that brought into being fractals. So when we see all these beautiful pictures on computers of things like Mandelbrot sets and Julia sets, that I'm sure your audience is deeply familiar with, they have all been brought into being through algorithmic processes, literally doing certain sequence of steps billions and billions of billions of times on computers. Now, the fractal revolution was possible because we got computers that we could begin to actually literally carry out these algorithms millions and millions of times and see what results in them. And the process of doing this hyperbolic crochet is also algorithmic. And you literally have to play it out. And the simple algorithm for making one of these hyperbolic forms is crochet end stitches increase 1, crochet end stitches increase 1, and just keep doing it until you get bored. So just as the process of fractals is about playing something out many, 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 many times, that's also the process of these crochet hyperbolics. And it's a very interesting thing that you cannot have an equation description of hyperbolic space. And the technical term for that is analytical. There is no such thing as an analytical description of hyperbolic space. Hyperbolic space was known to exist, but we cannot describe it with equations. And it's because of that mathematicians of the 19th century and the early 20th century thought that it couldn't exist in nature.
It's fascinating because it seems to, since there are so many, because of computers, and chaos mathematics is a great example of this, that computers are extending and vastly amplifying our ability to explore algorithmic space.
Yes.
That you can feel almost this a very massive cultural shift that exists on many levels, not just scientific and technological, but cultural, even political, to a sort of productive collectivity rather than an abstract, symbolic, rule-based order that we associate with sort of analytic mathematics. So you can even see that shift as being something that emerges that has deep cultural resonance, but it also really reflects our increasing relationship with computers. And one of the things that I love about the Coral Reef project is that it is actually very similar to many projects that are going on in digital space, online or with using computers, and yet it's not really about computers. So it's almost like it brings it back into the physical world, into the natural world, into a way that in a way that's very affirming. I mean, I'm thinking in contrasting it with a really marvelous online project, one of my favorite projects that, or mass collective projects that has happened online, which is this thing that Scott Draves did called Electric Sheep, and hopefully I'll have him on the show sometime. And basically what he did is he created algorithms for producing abstract visuals, trippy animation, basically. Mm-hmm. And then he would breed them, he would create, breed them according to, genetic patterns or, genetic processes. And then he would farm them out to people like SETI at home using their free computer space to render them. So suddenly you have thousands and thousands of people who are rendering these images that are being constantly recombined. And
fabulous.
And then, and this is the interesting twist, though, is that what was the criteria for selection in this evolutionary process? The criteria for selection was human taste.
Yes.
People would go and look at their screensavers and see a series of 30-second clips of these new, children of previous algorithms, and then they would see one that they liked, and they would select it, and then that would get selected to breed with other ones. So it was a process of bringing human selection and human taste into an essentially machinic, algorithmic process happening on a mass scale. And it's so formally fascinating, and yet there's still that sense that you're like staring through the screen into this other digital space that has this algorithmic logic, and there's a kind of aesthetic encounter and playfulness across that divide, which is very interesting. But at our time in history right now, it feels so much more affirmative to me to sort of bring that algorithmic logic, almost folding it back into our physical space, which is so stressed, which is so desperately needs reimagining and a reaffirmation. And there's something fascinating about how your project echoes some of those more digital developments in art and science, and yet it occurs in this very physical way.
Yes, I mean, I believe it has always been on my consciousness, Erik, that this is, as it were, a parallel with the movement in the digital sphere. I don't know, you're very perceptive and you see this. It's always been very, very important to me, the ways in which philosophically there is this parallel, but as you say, our project plays out in the physical world, not in the virtual world, and I think that makes a huge fundamental difference. And I would like to add one dimension to this discussion because I think it really is critical. One of the differences is, and it is probably the most significant difference between our project and these digital projects, apart from the fact that ours is happening materially and theirs are happening virtually, is who is doing it. I know of several of these great online collective organic evolutionary projects that have been done in the virtual space, and I really deeply admire them. The one you've mentioned is amazing. There's another one called Soda Plate that comes out of England, which is astounding. They're all being done overwhelmingly by men. Our project is being done overwhelmingly by women.
Well, and that's a good segue, Margaret, because I really want to talk to you about a lot of your work on women in science. I'm a big fan of some of your writing on that. I know you wrote the book Pythagoras' Trousers, God, Physics, and the Gender War. And, I think your project is so amazing that you made this progress in a very specialized area of math, and it was through a very specifically female handicraft, the crochet, and there's so much irony involved in your project and the fact that there's no men involved just because of the situation that we find ourselves.
Not because we excluded them, please.
Right, exactly. No, and that's the thing that's also so tragic. It's, it happens that way, and even though you invite them in, and then it results that way. And I also studied science, and I had terrible experiences in studying biochemistry in school, and all my teachers were men. And but in school, I also read this amazing book, which was about Barbara McClintock, called "A Feeling for the Organism," that kind of charted she discovered genetic research in corn and maize. And she made huge leaps, but was totally laughed off stage when she went to present it in front of an all-male audience. And I was just wondering if, if you had any personal experiences. I know you've studied theoretical physics, and you have a very traditional scientific background in your studies. And I was just wondering if, in your crochet project, have you received any kind of flack or, disparaging remarks from some of the men in the field, or has it been pretty positive?
No, it's actually been neither of those things. It's been something different, which I think in itself is very, very worthy of reflection. The response we've received from the scientific community to the Crochet Reef project has been a resounding silence. The project has been written about in major, in feature stories in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Guardian, the Times of London, all sorts of papers. Every single article has been written in the culture and arts pages. Every single, all the funding that we've got for the project through small grants has been from arts funders. Every science foundation I've approached for funding about the project has said no. And the science world has given it no press attention, virtually. So this has been of heart-rending sadness to me, because my whole life has been devoted to promulgating science and mathematics. And I have racked my mind about why this project, which is so good at communicating about some very deep areas of both mathematics and science to the public, and thereby fulfilling the goals that are always stated as the goals of public science outreach. Why has it been ignored?
It's shocking to me, too.
The project has now been invited to show it. We're going to show it at the Smithsonian late next year, and it will be the first time ever the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History has ever shown an art project, and it's because they really appreciate the confluence of science and maths and art.
That's fantastic.
And that will be after 6 years of it going. For the first 6 years of the project, all the support has come from the art world, and the science world has neither acknowledged it, written about it, or assisted it. And I think that says something very profound about why has that been. And I think there's one very, very clear reason. I think there are two reasons, actually. And the first is sheer sexism. Who's doing this project? It's a bunch of women nobodies, and it's not happening under the auspices of a university or any accredited research institute. There's no PhDs involved. There's no professors. There's no Nobel Prizes. It's true collective, bubble up from the mud, citizen science. And I think that in some sense the scientific world is threatened by that.
It's true, and I mean, this is a pattern that you point out in your book and a lot of your writing on women in science. And even as a young scientist, I was always very connected to the story of Hypatia of Alexandria, who was probably the first and last famous woman mathematician in Alexandria, and she was, they were so threatened by her that Cyril of Alexandria and 415 or something Christian monks mobbed and attacked her and stripped the flesh from her body and ripped her apart and threw her all over the city. And I think in a lot of ways women still face the kind of Hypatia complex when we try and make headway in specifically the fields of mathematics and physics, which is something that you mention a lot in your work. Why do you think it's very specifically those two fields? Why do you think math and science and trying to get women and women's projects in there? Why? I mean, I know you said sexism, but do you think that there's something deeper underlying that?
Well, in my book, Pythagoras' Trousers, I answer this question in a way that I think has real importance. The theme of that book the book didn't come out of trying to explain why women had been so absent in physics, but that was a result of what I came to believe about the history of physics. The history of physics, I think, can be seen as deeply enmeshed with the history of religion. That from the early days, what physicists thought we should define physics here as the discipline which seeks to find the mathematical relationships inherent in the physical world. And the search for mathematical relations in the world around us was seen for thousands of years as being essentially a search for the relationships by which the gods, or then the Judeo-Christian God, had created the world. So the fact that we have physicists talking about, when we find the theory of everything, we'll be seeing the mind of God. This is a reflection. This is just today's iteration of an ancient tradition that dates back to Pythagoras of Samos, that basically mathematical relationships in the physical world are the divine core of reality that the material world instantiates. That there is a sense in which physics can be conceived, and really was conceived for 2,000 years, as essentially a religious pursuit. And my contention is that the reason that this science has been so absent of women is because physics is essentially the oldest and deepest branch of the Church of Science, and that just as the Catholic Church, being the oldest and deepest branch of Christianity, has been the most resistant to female priesthood, so the Church of Physics has been the most resistant culturally to allowing women into its priestly ranks. And I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's a deeply ingrained thing in our culture that dates back to the Greeks, particularly to Pythagoras and his contemporaries, that the symbolic, abstract set of ideas, of which mathematics represents some sort of pinnacle, is quintessentially male. And what is quintessentially female is the material, the embodied, the earthly. And this male-female split between the divine, heavenly and symbolic and the earthly, the body material, is deeply ingrained in Western culture, primarily from our Greek heritage, and then it also got incorporated into Christianity. And I think it continues to play out in our society's attitudes to who is the suitable person to do these symbolic mathematical activities. And
what's
I think
fascinating also is how the difference between analytical mathematics and the kind of algorithmic processes that we were talking about adds an interesting wrinkle to this tension on a number of levels. One is that as you move away from the symbolic of the ability to capture things in a formula, and you have to instead experiment and explore with the space of numbers through iterative, in some ways very repetitive and not in themselves very interesting calculations, but whose mass result are these fascinating patterns, as in the case of fractals, or in exploring new kinds of geometries within nature. That there's kind of a shift there, particularly when you make that link between that's so fundamental to this project, between algorithmic processes and this fundamental feminine work or female work of knitting and weaving and stitching that goes back to, the Neolithic. Because there's a fundamental similarity between these sort of algorithmic processes that explore the production of pattern through simple iteration that really connects in with these deep natural processes that are not really driven by the complex symbolic analytical models that so much supported this kind of male, transcendent, Platonic view that we're coming out of. And I'm really thinking about this wonderful, crazy book by Sadie Plant called Zeros and Ones, where she just explicitly makes this sort of half feverish and half visionary argument about the connection between women's work, between weaving, and between digital computation. And she really sees the sort of emergent logic of algorithmic calculation and algorithmic culture as being as representing a significant cultural shift away from that transcendent male symbolic order towards something that has a more potentially feminist twist. It's a fascinating thing to think about, particularly in light of your project and the kinds of issues we're talking about.
Yes, and I think Sadie Plant is right that these processes basically historically go back to things that women were traditionally doing. But what is interesting is that in the age of the computer, again, it has shifted to, it has actually become, in practical terms, a world that is pretty much dominated and, ruled by men. When I was at university, after doing a degree in maths and physics, I did a degree in computer science. This was 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago now. And, we had high hopes. There was about 20% of my class were girls. And there were very high hopes that computer science was going to be a field, a highly technical field in which men and women might at last be equal. But it hasn't played out that way. In fact, numbers of, girls in, computer science PhDs peaked at about 25% about 25 years ago and have been dropping ever since all over the world. So although the roots of these algorithmic processes, as you say, Erik, are definitively in women's activities like weaving and knitting and etc., actually when it has become a realm of money and power, women haven't actually, for a very complex set of reasons, I think, it hasn't turned out to be a space where women and men are participating equally. Name one, Microsoft billionaire who's a woman. Is there one? There probably is, but I don't know of one.
I don't think so.
and why is that so? It's a very, to a lot of women, to women of my generation, this has been a huge disappointment. And I think what it suggests is that, as it were, when epistemological power and money come into play, somehow the power structures have very good at reasserting themselves. Look at our project. It is, as you say, Erik, about all of the same kinds of philosophical premises and processes that are behind the computer, all of these computer projects. We can't get funding from any science foundation.
It's true. A lot of the promulgation of a lot of these things, as you mentioned in some of your writing, I know, is through the awards and recognition aspect of the fields, because when these individuals and groups that create things don't get recognition, then no one hears about it and no one knows, and a lot of the groups that choose people who get the awards, when they're specifically not recognizing women in some of these things, then it's like they not only get discouraged, but, let's face it, a lot of them just straight up quit.
Exactly. And it isn't even just about getting awards, but just simply getting jobs. Yeah,
absolutely. And funding and research funding. Grants.
Yeah. Let me put a parallel here, because this is a very concrete thing. I'm sure you're familiar with the Ansari X Prizes.
Yes.
With the X Prize for flying into space. Well, the new X Prizes, I'm sure your audience is familiar, the prize is for $30 million, is to put a probe on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And so, after flying into space, now the aim is to get a probe on the moon by non-governmental forces. Now, it's great that people want to do that, but what there is now associated with the actual X Prize is a version of it for kids, which is basically you have to sort of do a simulation of getting a probe on the moon. I'm not sure you don't have to get an actual probe on the moon, but you have to build something in Lego Mindstorms and sort of do a play-acting version of getting on the moon. And there's several $1 million of prizes to do this. And Lego Mindstorms is a wonderful thing. I think it's absolutely fabulous. It's Lego and it's computer codes and electronics all mushed into one. I'd be willing to bet, guarantee 100% that 99.9% of the people who are going to be involved in that prize are boys. Now, that's great. I've got nothing at all against supporting such things. I think it's marvelous. What I ask is, why aren't there social mechanisms for funding similar initiatives that actually attract girls and women?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame. And another aspect of it, I think, is that the project is unusually rich in its cross-disciplinary quality. Like, there's a lot of work out there that's sort of described as interdisciplinary or connects art and science or whatever. But the dimensions of this project, with the collective production, with the ecological global warming, with this very kind of abstract ideas in mathematics, and its whole like institutional logic. Is it an art project? Is it a science project? Is it a public service? Is it a political statement about ecology? That when you have those projects, it's an unfortunate thing about our world that even at a time when obviously everything is being kind of mushed together, and if you're looking clearly, it's more and more clear how different dimensions of reality are weaving themselves together, and that the hot points are at cross junctures of very different kinds of discourses and practices, and that's where the action is. That the more you embody that space, often, generally, I would even say, the more difficult it is for existing institutions to support it, because institutions, like you were talking about academia before, are all interested in reproducing their own perspective or their own set of agendas and their own existing framework of reality. So it's almost like the more successful you are at weaving together multiple perspectives and practices, and actually therefore doing the work of, we're using this metaphor, weaving together our world in a way that empowers people to make connections between mathematics and environmentalism and the humble domestic practice that their grandmother taught them. That the more you can do that, the more you get kind of pushed out of the conventional circuits that sustain institutions in the world today. And it's a shame, but I see that all the time, and you really see it on the internet, where so many amazing projects are happening, and nobody's getting paid. So much so that people now just take it for granted that, you have a great collaborative project that involves lots of people working for free, like they work for free on Flickr, or they work for free on Wikipedia. And so now it's this sort of weird idea of like a collective labor pool that does creative projects for nothing. And then you try to bring that into an institutional logic, and they still want the heroes. They want the old model of the heroic scientist, the heroic, male who struggles against, problems to like build the plane that's going to make it to space. I mean, it's like we know that story, and yet it works in the institutional logic. And I don't know, are we in a process of transition and have to be patient? Are there ways to erode that institutional logic? I'm not sure.
I mean, to me, Erik, this is the fundamental question, because I think the shift that you're talking about, which is the shift that I'd like to see, away from power being concentrated in large institutions and to a more dispersed collective modalities of power and operation, that is actually, in my view, what the feminist revolution is at its core all about. and feminism, of course, has been deeply resisted ever since it got going. And I think it's because, like all true revolutions, it really does propose real, deep, structural societal change. And that is never going to happen easily. Real, deep, structural change in society is always going to be resisted by the people who have the power, no matter how much they claim to want to do things in new modalities. What they usually want to, is co-opt the revolutionary forces to basically come onto their side. Was it Marshall McLuhan who said, who was it who said commodify your dissent?
Oh gosh,
I
don't remember.
McLuhan, or no, I don't know, might be one of the French.
No.
But that's what happens. The dissent gets commodified and bought into the power structures and the money structures, and things which basically do genuinely propose another way of doing things, which are dispersed, which aren't going to reinforce the power structures, are going to be deeply resisted. And I think, that is I see that as the fundamental struggle of our time. How can we genuinely implement real collectivity and real support for collective dispersed decision-making, power-making, financial power tue?
Absolutely.
I think it's by doing projects like you're doing, Margaret.
and I want to just make sure that we just have a couple minutes left, that you can give people a URL or the best way to find out more about this project and your work online.
Oh, well, if people want to see the work, Chrissy and I have an organization called the Institute for Figuring, and its website is theiff.org, as in thief.org. And there's a huge amount of information about the Reef project, lots and lots of pictures about its incarnations all over the world, and also about the other projects that we do. There is no information on the IFF site about my books in my alternative life as writing books about the history of physics. I don't have a website about that, but
you can find them on Amazon, though.
You can find my books on Amazon. Yes, they're still in print, which is a wonderful.
And then where's the next place you're going to have a on-site gallery collection of the corals?
Oh, the next exhibition will be at the Science Gallery in Dublin, Ireland, in spring next year, and then in fall next year it's going to be at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. So that'll be opening in October at the Smithsonian. It'll be there for 6 months.
6 months, that's great. How much space are you going to have?
At the Smithsonian?
Yes.
The gallery, it's part of the Hall of Ocean Science, and it's a gallery that's about 1,500 square feet.
Wow.
Which is small for us.
Right.
We usually occupy about 3,000 square feet.
Well, Margaret, thanks so much. It's a great project, and I'm sure it's exhausting as well as exhilarating. But it seems very, very worthwhile. Do you crochet, Maja?
I do, actually. I'm a big crochet and knitter, and right after this, I'm going to go crochet something.
Maja, you must go and make a hyperbolic crochet.
Oh, I think that's fabulous. I'm going to do it.
It sounds like it is an infectious process.
It takes over your life. It is viral, and it can be like a virus. It can completely take over your system. It's a very, very powerful virus.
Excellent. All right. Well,
thank you very
both
much.
Very much. And you can find out more about my stuff on www.techgnosis.com, TECHGNOSIS. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Maja, and bye-bye from Expanding Mind. Keep it open.